working as a pastor, working as a minister in a church, people expect you in some ways to kind of have answers. And the hard part about that is I don't always have answers. And so that freaks me out too, because they want you to be a voice of reason for their spirituality in their life, which is a honor, but it's also kind of scary and daunting. But, when I read this book by Eugene Peterson, he really challenged what it means to just walk with people and be with people and do life with people and really be there with them. And when you really think about it, that's not something that you should do really carefully. There should be a lot of vulnerability in that, a lot of vulnerability when you're walking with each other. Welcome to Rethinking Christianity. On today's episode, I have taken the advice of my wife, and she told me that I should do an episode where I get on and I just talk. So this is going to be interesting. I've never thought about doing this. Usually I have things mapped out and I have a plan. I guess that maybe is how I am as a person, that I like to plan things out if I'm doing some kind of content. But, with the interviews and things like that, I found that it actually is better to have a couple questions planned out and things like that when I'm talking to guests. But really, the best conversation comes from when I'm really listening and when I'm really hearing what, certain guest members are saying about a book they have or whatever. So anyways, as I've been doing this podcast, and it's been a couple weeks, I've been so busy with the work at the church that I do. I hadn't really been able to put out an episode lately. And so, I've just been thinking, what do I even have to say? Because, the people that I talk to, they have a lot to say. And so a lot of times I do want to do more interviews because I don't feel like I have that much to say. And when I started doing this podcast, it was more so out of the hope of learning for myself and answering questions for myself. And as it's grown, I've tried to kind of hopefully have a balance of people that give different perspectives and things like that. One of the things that I think freaks me out a little bit when I think about being a voice for Christianity or spirituality or whatever is, sometimes I'll get DMs on Instagram, and people will be like, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Or what's your thoughts on this? I had someone recently message me asking me about baptism, and it kind of freaks me out thinking that people want my advice on something, but I guess it's also very kind that people think of me in that way. But yeah, I don't know. It's a weird thing, but and so that's why I try and do my best to platform guests and audience, or platform guests so that the audience can hear from others, not just myself. But my wife was talking to me and she was like, "You should do an episode where you just get on there and you just talk." And so that's what I'm doing. And I don't know how long this will go, and I don't know if it'll be helpful for you at all. But I'm just gonna, I guess, talk and work through or think about or talk through the things that I think about a lot. And lately, I don't want to get too into the specifics. So I've mentioned on my podcast what I do for a living. So I work at a church, where I live. And this church has actually been going through a split for the last year, or not last year, the last few months. And it's been interesting to observe just from my perspective on what's been going on. And I'm not going to get too into all that because I don't even know if I'm supposed to talk about it, which is also kind of a weird thing. Church is such a weird deal where, you have to be careful. And I think that's one of the things that I struggle with about, church and Christianity is a lot of times everything is all about being careful and making sure everything appears a specific way. And, I don't know. I think it's kind of strange. But yeah, so church I work at has been going through a split. I'm not going to get into the details of all of that, but it has been really wild lately. The last 3 months or so, last 4 months, I've been so busy just trying to help with the church that I stayed. I didn't leave. I still have my job. But, what I'm learning is people really have their beliefs and the things they strongly stand firm on. And I remember I read this book by Eugene Peterson called The Pastor. Um, and in this book, so when I was in college, I used to think that, one day I wanted to be a pastor or work at a mega church. And I actually ended up working at a pretty large church for a couple years as a part time student pastor. But, you know, when I was working there, I began to realize like this isn't the end all be all of working and doing ministry. Um, and so I got that job, and so when I was working there, I read this book by Eugene Peterson called The Pastor, and he was really out. It's a memoir that kind of outlines his personal journey as a pastor and his thoughts about what it means to be a pastor and to work as a pastor. And I think that there's so much pressure on churches to do things in a way that is continually drawing new members and drawing people that you miss the people that are there. Like you're focused on getting new people that you miss the people that are there. And I'm not saying that this mega church that I worked at necessarily did that, but you feel like you're a part of a machine sometimes. And I've heard that from friends that also have worked at mega churches. But I read this book and it really challenged me in my thinking of what it means to be a pastor. And a minute ago I mentioned how like I talk about how it kind of freaks me out a little bit, like that people want to hear what I think about something. And I guess part of that's kind of stupid that freaks me out because I'm the one who started a podcast, right? And I'm the one who puts myself out there and gives my opinions and does reaction videos and things like that. So part of it is on my own kind of deal. But the other side of it is working as a pastor, working as a minister in a church. People expect you in some ways to kind of have answers. And the hard part about that is I don't always have answers. And so that freaks me out too, because they want you to be a voice of reason for their spirituality in their life, which is a honor, but it's also kind of scary and daunting. But, when I read this book by Eugene Peterson, and he really challenged like what it means to just walk with people and be with people and do life with people and really be there with them. And when you really think about it, like that's not something that you should do really carefully. There should be like a lot of vulnerability in that, a lot of vulnerability when you're walking with each other. Like, I think about like a road trip. When you're on a road trip with someone that you know pretty well, um, say you take a group of people, at least this is my experience, or family, for instance, like you get into it, especially if it's a longer trip, you get into like arguments, you have times of joy where you're singing on the radio, listening to music, you have like, different things that happen, you get a flat tire. So, a road trip, for instance, there's a lot of vulnerability in that. And so working in church, being a pastor, doing church life or whatever, I think there's a lot of vulnerability. It should be in that when you're walking with people. And so for me, I'm challenged by that because a lot of times when I do this podcast or I put out content or I teach or I preach, I feel like sometimes I got to be careful about the things that I say and the things that I think and the questions that I have. And I don't think that that should be the case all the time. I think in some ways you need to be, because again, like there's this responsibility where people view you, if you work in a church, as someone that, oh, well, they have answers. They know what they want to do. And so like if you begin to call into question anything about your faith or have doubts or begin to change your mind or perspective on things, then other people are like, that can affect them. And it's like this cycle of like the church having to be careful. I think there's a quote, I think it's about Pete Enns. Yeah, it's about Pete Enns. Is like, if you can't be spiritually honest at church, then where can you be? And these thoughts could go into like, what is church? Like, what should church be? Is church like an event? Is church just a guy preaching? Is church just worship? And I think that this idea of like transparency and vulnerability and authenticity and walking with each other, and I think in some ways there has to be so much respect for each person who's on their journey. And, I see it all the time where, there's somebody that walks away from the faith or they have a different viewpoint on something or they believe in a different way. And a lot of times what happens is, like, there are people that are these, I guess you call them, like, truth protectors, where they're like, "No, you're not a real Christian anymore, you're not a real follower anymore." But my thing is, like, well, do we expect everyone to be on this same exact path? And do we expect everyone to, like, have the same answers to questions and have the same, like, resolves in their mind? And everyone has this different background and life and thing that they've gone through that's led them to where they're at. And I'm a person that I think about things very deeply. I don't mean that to, like, sound like, oh, I'm intelligent or whatever. I just, like, think about all the different angles. But what I've been trying to do lately is even more than just, like, trying to find answers, allowing questions to be a place of safety. That it helps me recognize my own humanity, that I know that I'm not perfect, and I know that I'm a struggling person, and I know that I have, like, deep thoughts sometimes, and the questions that I have about God and the questions that I have about the Bible, they remind me, like, you're just a human. You can't necessarily find the answer to these things. And that's a really beautiful thing when you really, really think about it, because, like, we all have these different internal struggles, these different things that we're all wrestling with and working through, and experiences of life. Like, I grew up in a home where, from like 4 years old, I had heard about this Jesus and God. And I remember one of the first movies I remember watching when I was young was The Prince of Egypt. There's this story of this group of people where it's the Exodus, where they're saved by God, and he leads them by clouds of smoke and fire, and he splits the ocean. And as a kid, it's such a cool story. But as I get older, sometimes I'm a human. I've never seen anybody do those things. I've never seen those things in my real life. And so I question and I ask. But, from a young age, like, I've been embedded into this, like, idea of, like, having answers, having truth. And, you know, what I'm realizing is, for me, I don't have those answers. I can't answer the questions that I used to confidently. I can't, like, say, "Oh yeah, I'm for sure about this. I know what's gonna happen at the end of my life." But there's part of me that sees this beauty in, like, being okay with that. And that doesn't mean I don't believe or I don't have faith. It's like a faith where I'm like, I'm choosing. I'm choosing to live this. I'm choosing to stay in it. I'm choosing to, like, keep moving forward despite the questions that I have, and keep, like, wrestling. There's so many, like, these stories in the Bible in the Old Testament that, like, there's different ways you can interpret scripture. And some of the metaphor that you can find in the stories of the Bible are really beautiful to the human experience. Like the idea of, like, God wrestling with man. I think it was Jacob. Like, why wouldn't that be the case? Like humanity recognizing their humanity and wrestling with it, and wrestling with the idea of existence, and wrestling with the idea of the universe, and all these big, big things. Um, why wouldn't it be like that, right? So, I don't know. This is actually, I'm really shocked that I'm able to talk this long about this stuff. I seriously have no notes or anything. But yeah, so, like, church is this thing where it's like people feel like they got to be careful all the time. Like, they got to be painted up right. They got to, and I don't know. I think that's a bunch of BS. I don't think we got to have all the answers. I think, and people will argue, like, well, if you don't have truth, then what do you believe in? Um, and that's a great question, right? So, I don't know. But being careful in church, like, Jesus was not a very careful person. When you look at him, the life that he lived, what you see in the Gospels, and his disciples after he died and he resurrected, like, the disciples weren't careful. They went into places and challenged what the traditional answers answers of truth were. And for Jesus, like, he was embedded in a culture where hundreds of years before him, from the exile and afterwards of the Israelite people, that the Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, was being formed, and they were, emulate they were evaluating and living and emulating answers that they had found into what it for them meant to live a spiritual life following the Lord or following Yahweh, as they would have called him. Or they wouldn't have said his name, but it's the Lord in English. But yeah, so like Jesus was embedded into these cultures, this culture where like truth was already established. And so for him to go into a place and begin to question and ask and really challenge everything is not careful at all. His disciples, like he picked the most like ragtag team of people to like be a part of his posse. Um and there are two things that I look at when I look at Jesus. I look at Jesus as someone like he clearly claimed and believed he was a higher power, a being of, the Son of God, the Son of and the Messiah. But also, like, I look at him as someone who he truly believed in what he was saying, but he also was like opening the doors of like questioning. Like one of the things he would always say was like to the rabbis and those in the synagogue and things like that. He'd be like, "You've heard it said, but I say to you this." And so he would challenge these different angles of Torah, these angles of the law, and what it meant to practice Sabbath and what it meant to follow God. And he was really, really poking these holes into like all the safety nets that had been created and the carefulness that had been created for people to follow so they could know that they're safe with God. And Jesus came as someone poking holes in that. And so I see Jesus as someone who did that, and he did believe that he was true and what he was saying was true. And then I also see the other side of Jesus where like he's just this man that is, and not just a man, but he's this higher being that's living and walking and breathing and doing life with people, eating meals with people, living life with people. And he was not only poking holes in the safety nets of religion, but he was also poking holes in the like safety nets of what it meant to live amongst each other, like the socio like economic standards of that time where he was hanging out with fishermen and tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners. And he was like truly poking holes and destroying these nets of safety that like kept people in the circles that they belonged, right? And I am so challenged by that when I'm thinking about questions about God and questions about church and questions about all of it. Like I'm not only challenged by like just what it means for me to be a loving and kind person that believes in Jesus and follows Jesus, but like what does it mean for me to reflect Jesus as a person who is like not afraid, like not afraid to like to believe things maybe they're a little different, but Jesus did that, and to question things and to ask about things and to just keep moving forward and choosing this faith. And I'm just so, really intrigued by these questions and this idea of carefulness. And so I I think that, maybe you're hearing these things and maybe I'm just rambling. I don't know. But for me, when I think about what I want to keep doing, it's what I'm doing. It's talking to people, it's discussing with people, it's like wrestling with God. Like I just I want to wrestle with God the rest of my life. I don't want to just be okay and settle in and pitch my tents on campgrounds of safety. I want to wrestle with God and I want to question things. I want to be like, I have these moments, like really seriously at night while I'll be laying there and I think about death and I'll think about it and I'm just like, I don't know what's going to happen. And it freaks me out. It really freaks me out. And there are times where I'm like the opposite of that, where I don't have fear, and I'm like, okay, I know I'm gonna be okay. That you know, there's something there, and so like I am always moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And maybe you're not in that camp, and maybe you think I'm a heretic or something, but I truly do believe most of the like orthodox beliefs. I just have questions about them, and And again, like there's this beauty in like having these questions. These questions that you have if you're listening, like these questions that you have are your humanity. They're your like I guess in some ways, I don't wanna call it brokenness, but we all are all broken, and our broken experiences lead us and develop us into who we are, and the complete pieces of our lives, the things where we're not broken, the beautiful pieces of our life that and experiences that have brought us to where we are currently. It all is this intertwined mosaic of things where we're called to something higher and we're called to something more. And for me, I'm gonna follow Jesus and wrestle with God, and I have hope in that, and it really allows me to have this guiding path of spirituality and trust and hope that we can be better than what we are as a people. We can be better than what we are as humanity, as creation, and we can see each other as children of God, and we can love each other, and we can be open, and we can have open arms and open tables and open minds. Actually, I think that is like the tagline of the Methodist Church, which is ironically where I work at. Um, and I only repeated that because I just heard it recently. But yeah, so like I hope that this is helpful. Like I really don't have like a plan for where I'm going with this, but I want you to think through like, you know, do you have questions? Like don't be ashamed of those. And the other thing that I hate, man, I hate this for people is like when their social life is so centered in on their faith and their religion, and if they begin to ask questions, like they have to like bottle it up because like if people disagree with them or they don't believe what they believe, like they can be isolated and exiled, and like it's just not right. Like for people to lose the beauty of community just because they're human, that's insane to me. That people can lose the beauty of community in church because they have questions, they deconstruct, maybe they walk away from the faith. Like, why should people lose their friend groups through that? And so there's for people that deal with that and wrestle with that, it's a really fearful thing for people. Because I have conversations with people that are like, they realize, like, I remember there have been moments where I have conversations with people for the first time about like questions and things like that. And I'm like, yeah, I have those same questions. And people are like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one. And for a lot of people, they're at that place. They think they're the only one in their friend group, which they're not usually. But there's sometimes people that are really harsh and just are not open. And they're like truth protectors. I think that's the phrase I want to use. Um, as if God needs protecting anyways. But yeah, I mean, it's just sad. It's sad to think about where carefulness has led people to be spiritually. And when I'm reading like people that came before me, like C.S. Lewis or like Thomas Merton, or like even more recently, like people like, Donald Miller or Rob Bell, like people that like are just these human beings that are really thinking about what it means for them to have faith. And they all have different ending points. And that's reality. That's the reality of existence and the reality of life. And for the church, I think there's got to be this way to like allow people to have these conversations and to have these places of safety. Not carefulness, but safety for them to be open-hearted and open-minded. Um, but yeah. So these are the things that I think about when I'm just sitting around and having conversations with my friends. And these are the conversations and the questions that I get from other people. And there's a lot of things that I'm wrestling with continually as I do these interviews and as I see things in the church that I'm like, I don't know about that, or I question church or whatever. But yeah, like at the end of the day, everyone needs to be able to walk the path that they're on. And I think people should be respectful towards each other in that. I think that Jesus would. I think Jesus would walk alongside the deconstructor, the person of certainty, the person of like no belief. Jesus was a person of all people. And that's who I want to be. I'm wrestling with God continually. I'm wrestling with my mind continually. But in my heart, I have this hope that I can be better from following Jesus, believing in Jesus, hoping in Jesus, and seeking out what it means to be human by following him. and trusting in him. And so I hope that's helpful. Like I get a lot of feedback from different people like on Instagram and TikTok. Recently I had some guys like there's people say some mean stuff on the internet. I had some guys recently tell me that I was a wicked devil or wicked, I was evil, I'm strayed far from God. And like whatever. Okay. You don't really know me, you don't know my heart. And so I hope that people would just be nice to each other, man. This whole thing is not simple. It's not easy. And the questions that you should ask yourself is like, why do I believe what I believe? Where did those beliefs come from? How did those beliefs become beliefs? Right? Anyways, I'm just rambling at this point. I hope this episode is helpful for you. If you have any feedback, man, or woman, or whatever, reach out to me on Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. I'm a regular dude. I don't have all the answers. But have a blessed week. I hope that everything is beautiful in your world. And if they're not, I hope they get better. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the podcast. This is Blake. Until next time, this is Rethinking Christianity. Thanks for listening to Rethinking Christianity. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from Rethinking Christianity, you can follow us on Instagram at Rethinking Christianity Podcast, as well as on YouTube and Facebook. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.